pleasure to greet you all here today, and it's a delight to take part in this shared endeavor. And it's an honor to introduce distinguished scholar Cristanne Miller, who's been a pioneer in Dickinson studies since her first book, A Poet's Grammar, offered readers new ways into understanding the poet's linguistic experiments. And that book was crucial for me in graduate school. Her accomplishments and contributions as a writer, editor, critic, teacher, and mentor are too numerous to note here. And for this reason, I'll concentrate on just some highlights of her work related to Dickinson. She's also an influential scholar of Marianne Moore and modernist poetics. SUNY Distinguished Professor at the University of Buffalo, Chris is a founding member and past president of the Emily Dickinson International Society. She served as the editor of the Emily Dickinson Journal for 15 years. She's written 2 books on Dickinson, most recently Reading in Time, Dickinson in the 19th Century, which was published in 2012. She also edited the important collection of critical essays, the Emily Dickinson Handbook with Roland Hagenbuchler, and the forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Emily Dickinson with Karen Sanchez-Epler. She has worked intensively to bring together a community of Dickinson scholars across national boundaries. She served as a mentor to me, as well as many other scholars and students of Dickinson, sharing her expertise and encouraging collaboration in the interest of extending knowledge of the poet's work. Most recently, she has devoted substantial attention to making Dickinson's poems and letters broadly available in ways that help readers make sense of her material forms, her shifting compositional processes, and her complex editorial history. She serves on the advisory board of the Emily Dickinson Archive, an indispensable publicly accessible online archive centered at Harvard University, directed by Leslie Morris. We'll hear more about this resource later in the conference from Leslie. Her important edition, Emily Dickinson's Poems as She Preserved Them, published by Harvard, received the MLA Scholarly Edition Prize in 2015. With Domhnall Mitchell, she's now completing what promises to be a landmark new edition of Emily Dickinson's letters. And I'll take up no more of our time so that Chris can give us a preview of the exciting new discoveries that await us. Please welcome Cristanne Miller.
Eliza, thank you so much for that extremely gracious introduction. I'm now going to start sharing my screen. Talking about letters seems like the perfect thing to do in a conference on distance and connection. And in fact, editing a new volume of Dickinson's letters and what Thomas Johnson and Theodore Ward called prose fragments is both a huge task and an extremely exciting one. This afternoon, I will present a brief summary of ways that the 1958 Johnson and Ward volume is out of date, the major changes in inclusion of documents, conception, redating, and revision of letter presentation in our edition, which we anticipate will be forthcoming in 2022 with Harvard. And then I'll talk about one new discovery that we find particularly exciting. This edition is in every way a joint project between me and Domhnall Mitchell. Johnson and Ward co-edited the 1958 letters. In some ways, Ward seems to have been the driving expert on Dickinson in that collaboration. For example, Jay Leda consulted primarily with her in preparing his Years and Hours, but she's designated as an associate editor. With Domhnall and myself, there is no primary or associate. This is a Miller-Mitchell edition, names arranged alphabetically. Johnson and Ward performed a major service to Dickinson studies in their work of manuscript assimilation, detection, and textual scholarship, as was appropriate for the mid-20th century. We are in their debt. We also want to acknowledge our debt to Mabel Loomis Todd for her prescient work in collecting letters soon after Dickinson's death, without which they would probably have disappeared, and to all other editors of the poet's letters leading up to the 1958 letters. Our new edition proceeds from the fact that the letters of 1958 is now woefully out of date. Since 1958, around 28 new letters have been discovered or reconstructed. This list includes some letters already published, for example, those to Joseph Lyman, Abaya Root, Emily Fowler Ford, Edward Everett Hale and the Norcrosses. It also includes some letters that we are publishing for the first time, including one to Dickinson's uncle Joel Warren Norcross, notes to Adelaide Hill and Maddie Dickinson, a letter to Jane Bates, and notes to unknown recipients. We have also located manuscripts thought to be missing. For example, 2 in the possession of Sister Mary Jane Powers in Milwaukee. It will be the most important work of our edition to publish previously unknown letters, letters previously not transcribed from original manuscripts, and to collect published but previously uncollected letters within a single edition. Of similar importance, Johnson and Ward print only a tiny fraction of Dickinson's letter poems. That is, letters that include no prose, preface, or conclusion, just a poem. We will include all letter poems that contain any mark of being letters, that is, contain either an address or a signature, even if Dickinson writes that address on the verso of a folded letter, as she often does with Sue. This will add an additional 198 letters to the edition. Together, these editions will both transform a reader's sense of Dickinson's range of writing to already known correspondence and include new correspondents for whom only letter poems remain extant. For example, Gertrude Vanderbilt. It will also present more accurately what we call the modes of Dickinson's correspondence. Perhaps second in importance in our edition is the dating of letters, now also terribly behind the scholarship. Some redating has been done by critics, biographers, and editors such as Myra Himmelhoek, Jay Leda, Alfred Habiger, and Ralph Franklin. But we are also radically redating several letters and some complete correspondences, including those on which others have worked extensively, like the Bowles correspondence. This has been primarily Domhnall's work. Redating is enabled in part by the Ebenezer Snell meteorological records of weather in Amherst, which allow us to know, for example, when Dickinson dates a letter Wednesday and describes a heavy snowfall for the preceding 3 days, it has to be Wednesday, January 17th, not the 5th or the 12th or the 24th in a particular year. These records were not available in 1958. The existence of archives, such as America's historical newspapers, and the availability of Lavinia's diaries also enable much greater precision in reference to events and publications mentioned in the letters. And building on the work of others, Domhnall has additionally been reading peripheral correspondences that indicate dates more precisely than we have known them previously. Again, for example, of Sam and Mary Bowles's movements. To give 3 examples, we have redated a letter to Austin previously printed as Autumn 1844 to 14 October 1844, thanks to the Snell weather records and Williston Seminary catalog for the year ending 1845. Johnson letter 40 to Emily Fowler Ford, which Johnson and Ward dated about 1851 and placed first in that year's correspondence, has been redated as 11 December 1851. Again, thanks to the Snell records and to Vinnie's extensive record of visits between Emily Fowler and the Dickinson sisters. In 1876, Dickinson wrote to Abigail Cooper mentioning a fire that destroyed much of the Palmer block. Previously dated about 1876, we have redated this letter to mid-March 1876. Since the Amherst record dates the fire as March 13th. In this letter, Dickinson writes an important correspondent of her later years about a local event that had just occurred. Redating letters creates a new understanding of the narrative of Dickinson's life, not just within particular correspondences, but across her range of letter writing as it remains to us. We think our volume will tell a new story, not transforming basic understanding of Dickinson's life, but certainly altering some of its contours. A volume of letters tells its story through several features in addition to the primary content. Domhnall and I are also giving extensive attention to the apparatus of our volume, in particular to updating several Johnson and Ward assumptions about gender and class. For example, they refer to all women by their husbands' names, Mrs. Josiah Holland, rather than Elizabeth, even though Elizabeth is Dickinson's intimate friend, often addressed as sister or little sister. How many of you have wondered what Mrs. Henry Hill's first name is, or Mrs. Edward Tuckerman's? Johnson and Ward provide no easy access to the information that their names are Adelaide and Sarah. Their glossary gives information primarily or exclusively for men, although Dickinson's relationship may be only with the women of these families. One finds Edward and Frederick Tuckerman, but no Sarah. For the Sweetser family, they list Catherine Dickinson Sweetser and Charles John and Luke, but not Abby, Mrs. Luke Sweetser, or Cornelia, Mrs. J. Howard Sweetser, to whom Dickinson wrote, "There are no extant letters for Charles John or Luke." Abigail Cooper received 27 letters, but the biographical information is exclusively about her husband, James, who, to our knowledge, received none. This bias significantly erases the importance of Dickinson's relationship to women in her life, especially in her last decade when she is engaged in warm correspondence with many neighbors. These women preserved her notes, often endorsing them with her name and a date of receipt. They recognized that Dickinson was a writer of importance during her lifetime. Calling women by their given names both clarifies and provides greater accuracy of reference. As one example of such accuracy, Johnson and Ward name Lou Norcross as Louise. Habiger, now several years ago, definitively established that this niece's name is Louisa. But I would say at least 90% of scholarship, even coming out today, refers to Louise because it relies either directly on the 1958 letters or on scholarship relying on the 1958 letters. Even feminist work continues to refer to Mrs. Hill or Mrs. Tuckerman, although very few women or men would regard Mrs. as the appropriate signifier of a woman's identity today. Class assumptions also come into play. In Johnson and Ward's glossary and annotation of letters, biographical information focuses almost exclusively on professionally active men. Granted, this information is important because Dickinson was part of a well-known family with a father who was a significant Massachusetts politician and a brother who was also a lawyer and community leader. She circulated among highly professional people as acquaintances and friends. At the same time, her letters are filled with mention of merchants, shopkeepers, servants in the Dickinson or other households, and people of various classes in her community. While we need to keep our annotation brief, partly because of Harvard's page limits, we attempt both there and in the glossary to identify people across the entire range of her life engagement. Dickinson also circulated in the non-professional world of dressmakers, pharmacists, glove merchants, indigenous basket weavers, at least one itinerant berry seller, and people working in her family's kitchen, garden, or barn. Especially her early letters to Austen are full of information about births, marriages, illness, and death across Amherst's classes. Once, when she provides no local news, Austen scolds, and Emily responds defensively that Vinnie said she was going to write the local news. Austen, Vinnie, and Emily obviously shared an interest in the life of the entire community. Either Domhnall has or I have looked at the manuscript for nearly every letter still extant, with the exception of those in private hands that we haven't been able to access, and a few that COVID-19 has prevented us from traveling to see, although we hope very much that in 2021 we will again be able to travel. In our transcriptions, we find frequent instances where Johnson or Ward miss a word, misread a word, or misrepresent a manuscript. In an 1883 letter to Susan, for example, Johnson and Ward transcribe a medication Dickinson requests as the little vial I still have labeled Mir Sol Han. There, Mir, followed by a dash, should be Merck, followed by a period. Dickinson requests a homeopathic solution called Mercurius solubilis Hahnemann. Some instances of change are trivial. Johnson and Ward add 2 paragraph breaks to their transcription of letter 487 to Elizabeth Holland. Others are more substantial. For example, letters, so-called letters to Otis Lord or to the Norcrosses sometimes consist of drafts reconstituted as if a single letter in ways that do not follow the manuscript evidence as we see it or clearly acknowledge the editorial fiction. Although we also acknowledge the challenge of printing this material since it's been badly mutilated or exists only in transcribed fragments. Letters from Helen Hunt Jackson to Dickinson are grouped under the name of people with whom she had no contact, such as Maria Whitney, and combined letters Jackson wrote over a period of several months. For example, JL 573 to Maria Whitney is followed by Jackson letters listed as JL 573 A, B, and C. We present letters to or about Dickinson with a number relating, okay, now it's not letting me move through my slides. There we go, whoops. There we go, got it. We present letters to or about Dickinson with a number relating to that correspondence. For example, Jackson 123, not with a Dickinson number and secondary alphabetic designation. This enables us to present these letters at the point in the correspondence that is appropriate to the exchange. All letters to Dickinson or about Dickinson will be listed in the table of contents so that they're easy to find as such. While Johnson and Ward always indicate in a note whether a letter manuscript is incomplete, in draft, or missing, implying that only a transcript remains, we make such distinctions more obvious by placing draft or transcription by the transcriber's name at the beginning of a letter. Some drafts represent letters that were clearly part of an active exchange, judging from other letters in the correspondence or their direct response to an interlocutor, but others bear no such evidence. Our annotation, again, unlike Johnson and Ward's, is not interpretive. Deciding what the evidence of a letter or draft means is that is, the critic's job. Ours is to make clear the evidence we work from. More than Johnson and Ward, we place Dickinson's handwriting in the context of 19th century handwriting conventions. Dickinson marked paragraphs and also lines of verse following conventions legible to her peers, but not to many current readers, namely by leaving lateral space at the end of a row of script, not indenting a new paragraph's first line. 19th century punctuation is often casual and variously inscribed with reverse commas, dashes, and marks above the letter I and periods that resemble accent marks or are otherwise elongated. This is especially true of Dickinson's script when she writes in pencil. A late letter to Catherine Sweetser includes such non-standard marks, and I have little pointers to some of the low periods here. Johnson and Ward also transcribe a paragraph break at the bottom of the page following each, but we don't see any reason to call a paragraph break there on either page. Here you can see our transcription of this letter in which we put in brackets every place where our transcription differs from Johnson and Ward's. And just to give another example, if you look at the mark after Emily, that very high mark, they transcribe that as a period. We transcribe it as a dash. And in fact, it's a mark that she uses frequently in other letters, a mark of the same kind. Or in this image of an 1847 letter to Austin, Dickinson uses a double period after the word grandmother, I hope you can see it here, which they transcribed as period and then a comma. She uses a very long line after the word Mrs., which they transcribe as a period. In this period, in fact, Dickinson is using lots of periods. So you can see after the words Jacob and Holt, or at the bottom of the page by her signature, she writes, your app sister, period, Emily, period. Or at the beginning of the letter, she writes, my dear brother, period, Austin, period. Right? So quite irregular punctuation from our perspective. By the way, the cross-hatching in this letter is also entirely typical of Dickinson's early letters, where she's trying to use every possible space on the page when she writes. We do not alter Dickinson's usage, but in our introduction, we let readers know that such things, double periods, were unlikely to have had interpretable significance for Dickinson. We intend not to reproduce the look, the visual aura of a manuscript page, but to reproduce Dickinson's handwriting in print, according to our understanding of her writing habits, 19th century conventions, and standards of clarity for a 21st century reader, informed by our own research and by others' scholarship. There have been no new major developments in dating Dickinson's handwriting, but Franklin's observation about Dickinson's script have been helpful, and Domhnall has spent hundreds of hours noting when Dickinson makes certain kinds of letters, capitalization, or punctuation across the decades. And I must say that here, conversation with Marta Werner has also been very useful about punctuation and letter formation. As just indicated, at times we interpret marks differently from previous editors. For example, both Johnson and Franklin tend to interpret reverse commas, that is marks that slant to the right, as dashes. We regard them as commas and note that Sam Bowles and Helen Jackson also use reverse commas. Dickinson is not drawing letters or punctuation as a visual artist. She does not make marks precisely. She often writes quickly and her habits change. Any printing of Dickinson's manuscripts requires interpretation as to some punctuation and capitals. While we maintain Dickinson's idiosyncrasies of style, spelling, and form, we also use common sense. For example, a mark that might be called either a dash or a comma that immediately precedes a new sentence would reasonably not be a comma. But if Dickinson marks punctuation clearly, we do not change it to make it conform to any logic or norm. It was also a convention of 19th century letter writing to use formal signatures, except within the family or for extreme intimacy. And here I return to something that Maya Wang was talking about this morning. For example, several letters Dickinson wrote to Abaya Root during her teenage years begin, "Dearest Abaya," or "Ever dear Abaya," and express love for her friend, but then conclude with something like, "Yours Af," meaning affectionately, Emily E. Dickinson. One letter concludes, "Your Af sister," underlining sister, Emily E. Dickinson. In the mid-1870s, Dickinson signed herself E. Dickinson in writing to her good friend Sarah Tuckerman. By the 1880s, however, she signs letters to this friend with love and a happy flower, Emily, or lovingly Emily. Dickinson's changing signature reveals the increasing intimacy of this relationship. At the same time, understanding a period's conventions helps readers navigate expressions of intimacy within an appropriate cultural frame. Formal signature does not, for Dickinson or her contemporaries, necessarily denote emotional distance. One of our most exciting discoveries and work on this edition involves what Johnson and Ward designated prose fragments and placed at the end of their volume. While some of the sentences or passages they position here are indeed found on scraps of paper and written in rough hand, others are written on full or cut pieces of stationery, like this one. And in one document, Dickinson copied 5 thoughts or phrases on a ledger page. Remarkably, here she records pieces of prose in the way she recorded poems. She collects them on one page and draws lines between them. There's the transcription. These are not fragments for the most part. They are fully conceptualized statements or phrases, thoughts. Here's another preserved piece of prose under which Dickinson drew a line, as she does under so many poems in her fascicles. We believe that Johnson and Ward's prose fragments are in fact a repository of ideas and language Dickinson wanted to preserve. Some have rhythmic qualities or even slant rhyme, just as some of her letters contain meter or rhyme. This is perhaps language that Dickinson imagined she might use in either a letter or a poem. And indeed, the preserved phrase grasped by God was used in a poem in a slightly altered form, as Magda Zawodowska has written about. By combining preserved phrases and statements with drafts of letters, Johnson and Ward give the impression that they are all drafts or fragments of something longer. Yet in several cases, Johnson and Ward make these saved language units more fragmentary than Dickinson did. This is most clearly true in manuscripts like the one I showed you earlier, where Johnson and Ward disperse statements that Dickinson wrote contiguously. Here, they number her collected reflections on this one page as prose fragments 110, 72, 80, 111, and 89. That is, as far as we can see, with no logic and no reference to the actual manuscript. 5 more pieces of preserved prose were collected on both sides of a long strip of wrapping paper, also with lines drawn between passages when it was needed to mark the end of one thought and beginning of the next. On the recto page, there is no line, since this is the only passage written on the manuscript recto. Johnson and Ward do not date prose fragments. We are attempting to do so. In this case, the 2 longer passages on this narrow strip suggest a date of around July 1877, since the little citizen is almost certainly Gibb, 2 years old in the summer of 1877. And on the verso, the references to election, president, magistrate, mobs might suggest President Rutherford Hayes, who was the winner of a highly contested presidential election in November 1876, and who visited Boston and other New England cities in June of 1877. This view shows Dickinson's lines drawn to distinguish pieces of prose on the slip, and you can see at the very bottom, the foot of the page, there's another line. In another case, and here is again our transcription of the fragments that are collected on the recto and verso of that one slip of paper. In another case, Johnson and Ward separate as prose fragment 64 and 73 statements Dickinson wrote on the recto and verso of a single page, although in our view, the statements have a clear continuity. On the recto, Eve left her pretty gowns to the trees, but they won't always wear them. And then on the verso, a sufficing, enchanting wardrobe. We combined these as a single piece of retained prose instead of separating them by several fragments. In our edition, we will move drafts that belong to a particular correspondence to positions indicating that association, typically in a note to a letter or as a draft following the letter. The remaining prose pieces, beginning with one from the 1850s, including several from the 1870s, and concluding with several from the 1880s, will be clustered as Dickinson wrote them, placing recto and verso writing consecutively, and they will be organized by date to the extent possible. Again, we feel that this different conception and presentation of her retained prose gives a significantly different sense of Dickinson as a writer. Dickinson did not write drafts for most of her letters. Her retained prose functions like a thought book or a writer's notebook, preserving language she may have wanted to use in more than one correspondence or context. Our goal is to produce an edition of letters that is up to date with knowledge about extant manuscripts, 21st century editorial methods, and Dickinson scholarship. Because few scholars now consult beyond the 1958 letters when they are reading or quoting particular correspondences, and in fact, it's not easy to do so, misinformation has continued to circulate long after critics and biographers have corrected it as to names, dating, extant correspondences, and the order or other particulars of individual letters. Our edition will such information within a single cover and additionally contribute substantial new information and ways of understanding the letters. In a 2019 MLA paper, Jerome McGann imagined the current editorial goal as determinative, not definitive editions. While this edition will in every way replace the Johnson and Ward, we of course imagine that it too will eventually be replaced. We hope it will be determinative, useful to scholars, and a joy to readers for a very long time. But we also trust that scholars will continue to make new discoveries about Dickinson's letters, and that we will learn more about her correspondence and her manuscripts. And before we go to questions and answers, I just want to say that in my footnotes to this paper, I thank many scholars who've worked on letters besides the ones that I mentioned, but I want to call out three here because they've been such active members of EDIS, and I believe they may be present now. Marta Werner, who I mentioned briefly, and Ellen Louise Hart and Martha Nell Smith. So we are truly in the debt of everyone who has worked on Dickinson's letters, and we are trying to make the best use we can of all available information.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a wonderful presentation. Very, very exciting. I can't wait to see this edition come out. And I'm sure there are many questions here. If you'd like to ask questions, the best way to do that is to go under participants. Hang on, let me just change my view here. Go under participants, and you see that you can mark a hand, put your hand up. And if you put your hand up, then I will call on you. That's the best way. If that doesn't work for you somehow, you can also request to ask a question in the chat function. So first, put up your hand. It's a blue hand in participants. And next, if that doesn't work, ask a question in chat and I'll call on you that way. So I haven't noticed who posted their hand first, but I'll start at the top with Martha Nell Smith. Martha Nell?
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing your work, yours and Donald's work with us. As you know, I think letters are always very exciting. And so I'm always curious about work on them. And there have been, additions since Johnson and Franklin, or since Johnson and Ward. But my question's not really about those. I'm curious if I understood correctly that you said Dickinson did not write drafts of letters?
Yes, we think we feel quite convinced that Dickinson did not draft most letters that she wrote. In some correspondences, she clearly drafted letters. And so for example, to Johnson, there seems to be some evidence that she drafted letters. There are many instances where one can find a passage, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, that appears in a letter. Some of those we imagine are in fact drafts. So for example, there are some drafts of letters to Sue, but
Right.
evidence is that primarily she does not draft letters.
So
Just say that she does draft some letters. We're not saying she never does, but that she does not draft most of her correspondence before writing it out formally to send. And we are convinced of this for a couple of reasons. One, frequently in the letters themselves, she refers to how quickly she's writing. I only have a minute to finish this, or whatever.
Right.
Second, many the older later letters are either to work from saved material.
Chris, I think
those retained prose
I can't hear the answer.
or phrases or passage.
your audio stream is having trouble, Chris.
So we're saying not that she never drafts, but that she doesn't typically draft.
Okay, I was just curious because I don't know how we can know she didn't draft and throw the drafts away.
You have an answer, Chris?
Just
On my end, there's an audio problem. I don't know if other people are experiencing
the
that.
correspondence.
Yeah, I can't hear.
I think it help everyone if you turn off your video. So it's wonderful, wonderful to see you.
Okay, Karen Santos-Epler suggests that if we all turn off our live faces, that we will be able, that maybe Chris will be able to, maybe her visual audio stream will work. So I'm going to say goodbye in terms of my face, but I'll be here.
And I think also maybe Chris too might want to turn off her video for a second.
Chris, could you, I'll chat her, I'll post something to chat for her too. Chris, can you hear us? Chris?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think maybe everyone should try to turn off their, I'm not sure how much it will help, but if they will turn off their visual component and maybe mute, maybe it will be easier. So go ahead, Chris. Martha Nell asked, did you hear, she asked how we know that Dickinson didn't throw her drafts away. And then we'll need to move to the next question.
Yeah, it is not our impression that that's what she's doing.
Chris, would you like to maybe post the answers in the chat if
Sure.
we're still having trouble with it? Are other people still having trouble hearing her?
Less trouble now.
Not as much as
Not as much,
previously.
right.
Okay. So maybe Yifeng Zhang has a question. Yifeng?
Hello. Can
Hello.
you hear me?
Would you like to ask your question, Yifeng?
Yes. Yes. Hi, Chris. Thanks
Hi.
for your perfect presentation. To avoid the traffic, so I turn off my camera. Let me try. Can I speak normally? Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Now it's almost 3 o'clock in China, and I try to pinch my arm to keep me awake. But after hearing your presentation, I get sober. I just have one question for this new version of letter that you mentioned you will try to use the 21st century editorial method. So I'm wondering, can you elaborate a little bit about on what ways, how will you represent maybe the weird or the frugal way that Dickinson made the full use of the paper, or other special way to let us know the full picture of her letter, what's that really like? So how will you do that? What kind of method you will use?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me. Okay. We are not attempting what the letter page looks like at all. So we will not attempt in any way to reproduce the look of the manuscript page. We're not attempting that. But for example, when Johnson and Ward were printing the 1958 letters, technology didn't allow them to use a cross-out function. And so they had to use a bracket to show a word that had been canceled by Dickinson. We'll use when I talk about 21st century editorial practices, I'm partly talking about things like the apparatus, and I'm not talking about, not only talking about technologies of print, but the main thing I think that you're asking has to do with the look of the page, and we are not attempting in any way to reproduce the look of the page. This is a print edition to follow visual features.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you finished, Chris?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay, Yifeng? All right, Vivian, do you have a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. My question has to do with the 198 letters that, as I understand it, are in or related to the letter poem genre. Do you mind just repeating what you said about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. We are, Johnson and Ward print a very few of the letter poems, almost none. We are printing everything that Dickinson sends as a, let's say, letter poem that has any clear indication of being a letter. That is to say, it must have either a signature or an address. If it's just a poem written on a piece of paper with no signature and no address, even if we know that it was sent to, let's say, Bowles, then we do not include it. The vast majority of the letter poems include either a signature or an address or both. And that number of additional letter poems that we are including that were not in Johnson and Ward is 198.
Great.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to keep going for a few more minutes, even though I'm aware that we have a session at 3 o'clock. Is that right, Elizabeth?
Yes, that's correct.
So I'm just going to go for maybe 5 more minutes so people can ask questions. If they're not able to ask the question, if you're not able to ask your question by the time we wrap up, I encourage you to post your question to chat, and we will, Jane Wald, could you save the chat? And hopefully Chris can find some way to answer those additional questions, because there are lots of questions here. And I know that we've had some audiovisual issues. So please post your question to chat. I'll answer a few more questions, though. I think we have a little more time. So Cindy Mckenzie is next. Cindy?
Hi, thank you. Am
Hi.
I coming through? Am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay, hi, Chris. Happy to see you, and very excited about seeing your new edition. Having spent a lot of years with the letters when I compiled the concordance to the Johnson edition of the letters, and then again compiling a collection of critical essays with Jane Eberwein, I'm very interested to see what kind of changes. Now, you did mention that there were 28 new letters. Is that the number that you?
There are 28 letters that have been discovered or reconstructed since the 1958 letter.
Okay.
So these include things like the Lyman letters that Sewell published. So some of these have already been published, some have
but
not
in
yet.
a different, yeah.
Or some have only been published in part. Yeah.
Right. And what's the book going to look like? Like the Johnson was a 3-volume box set.
Yeah, well, okay. So I was just talking to a wonderful editor Joel Meyerson, who's edited many things in the 19th century American literature. And his advice was to just send to Harvard exactly what we want printed and let them figure out whether it will be 1 volume or 2. Now they're saying 1 volume, and so it will probably be something like the 1 volume reprinting of the 3-volume letter set. I don't know how many of you have seen this. So it will be around, it will be at least 1,000 pages,
about that,
probably somewhat longer.
Yeah.
Will they be able to fit all of that in 1 volume? In a way we're saying, okay, that's your problem.
Right.
We're doing our work.
Yeah.
We'll
and then the
end up
final
having to
question, and I know that you have answered this by private email, but just for the audience here, my concordance, which was published in 2000 and is still in print, and I still receive royalties, which is quite a feat, I think, for such a specialized text. You said that you will be including the Johnson numbering. So right? The Johnson numbers?
The letters will be renumbered because they've been redated. They've been radically redated. And so they will have new numbers. There will be appendices and indexes at the end. We're getting lots of questions about indexes. So there will be an appendix that shows the relationship of our numbering system to Johnson's numbering system. It will also show the letters that are not included in Johnson because they will have numbers and his won't and so on. But we will not, the letters will not be listed by Johnson numbers.
Great.
Anyway, so you know how the way we use the concordance by Rosenbaum, people still use that for the poems, and they go to the first line, and then they transfer that to the Franklin poem. So it's kind of like it adds another step until we have a concordance to your edition. Anyway, I just thought I would bring that up.
I'd like to get some more questions in, Cindy. We just have a few more minutes, so maybe you could talk with Chris about that privately. Marianne Noble has a question, and Marianne, would you like to ask it?
Sure. I was just wondering why you chose to go with a hardcover book instead of putting the thing entirely digital. It seems like as a digital object, it would have more access, and it would also be searchable and so forth. And so I was just curious about why you made that choice. Partly because we're thinking of creating something.
Of course. Harvard says that it would make plans to eventually put this online, to make it electronically available. But partly, of course, we're interested in a print volume because we believe that print volumes have some kinds of circulation that are more effective than online circulation. And since this is the first major new edition of complete letters since 1958, we think that there should be a print volume. So yes, we will push very hard for it to go online electronically. This partly answers some of Cindy Mckenzie's questions about cross-referencing and finding, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It should be online. And furthermore, Domhnall is also already talking about a follow-up volume in which he gives more of the information that we can't include in our notes and glossary because we are restricted as just
good notes.
That online.
Maybe, so there's time for just one more question. I'm sorry I don't have the first name, but Milagros is the last name.
Yeah, it is me. That is my first name. Thanks, congratulations. And I would like to ask you whether you have discovered any new letters to or from Suzanne Dickinson.
Yes, I answered that in the chat line. Unfortunately, no. That would have been very exciting.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that was quick. How about, can we do one more with Zelia? Is Zelia there? Nicole,
yeah, I'm sorry. Can you
sorry,
hear me?
Zelia. Okay.
No, it's fine. It was technical. My question, I already put it up in the chat, but I'd like to know if you're going to include an index of the poems contained in the letters, because I found it really difficult to navigate the Johnson edition because of that. So thank you, and congratulations for your work.
Thank you. Not done yet. There will be an index of letters as sent to each recipient or a correspondent that will include years in which those letters are sent, our letter numbers for the letters sent, and any letter in which that includes either that is a letter poem or that includes a poem, either as an enclosure or as part of the text of the letter, will be marked in bold. Now, we haven't actually talked about whether we would have a separate index that refers to poem titles themselves, and you're suggesting that that would be useful thing to do, we'll think about it. That's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. The next session starts in just a few minutes. So I'm very sorry that I didn't have a chance to get to everyone's question, but please post them in the chat. We'll tape the chat, and hopefully we'll find a way to respond to those questions, or you can contact Chris. You can't meet her in the hallway, but I'm not sure. But let's thank Chris for her wonderful talk. Thank you, Chris, and we look forward to the edition. And the session has been a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming.
And so then